A second time, I give the call to the honourable member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to talk on the appropriation bill, specifically in the context of the defence appropriations. And really, this is also in context of the cumulative effect of the budgets during the coalition government. Now, Labor has always said, and we continue to say, that we would be very keen to make sure that cooperation in this space is bipartisan. We all, I think, across the chamber believe in the concept of bipartisanship on national security, and certainly my colleague here in the chamber with me and other members of the coalition and Labor do that in the context of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security in a very effective way. I think, however, we've all been disturbed, and I think the public, and I know many members of the coalition as well, on the degree to which the current Minister for Defence Industry attempts to politicise this space. And he's made some quite outrageous assertions in that context. Certainly, I think we could do a lot better as a minister in that space, and there are very many candidates on the coalition side I could suggest, including yourself, Mr Deputy Speaker. But what we've seen in this 4 years has been chaos, confusion and dysfunction in the portfolio. We've had 3 different ministers, and a 4th seems to be on the way, if you believe the reporting, including David Canoe-Johnston, who had particular issues. I know part of his problem was dealing with the PMO at the time as well, and he was hindered in that respect by that relationship with the PMO. But what we've seen is a distortion of the history. Now, across governments, there are always issues with defence procurement, managing highly complex platforms and technologies, and getting that right has always been a challenge for governments of all colours. So it's not just one government that tends to have these problems, but many governments over a long period of time managing projects too that straddle governments. Now, the few that I'm particularly concerned about in getting the record straight here include Land 400, which is the project to replace our armoured vehicles, the combat reconnaissance vehicle and infantry fighting vehicle capabilities. We've also seen issues to do with shipbuilding and projects of concern issues. When we attained government in 2007, we discovered there were about 21 projects that were in serious management crisis and had serious issues. So we had to create a projects of concern process to manage that. And by the time we left government, we'd managed to remediate that down to about 6 projects. But there'd been significant disasters like the Sea Sprite, which involved the expenditure of $1.4 billion of public money for an aircraft, an airframe, that we didn't get any flying time out of at all and had to be abandoned completely. Labor remediated that by getting the Seahawk Romeos on board, which are world-leading aircraft now being deployed. There was also a landing craft disaster where $40 million was spent on landing craft that didn't fit any vessel we owned at the time or any vessel we were going to acquire. It was quite extraordinary, and of course they've been dispensed with as well. But in Land 400, I'm particularly concerned about that and the process that's underway at the moment. Under Labor's plan for Land 400, we were going to acquire 1,100 vehicles. We would have been through first pass approval in March or April of 2014, and we've had the situation where not only has that timeline slipped significantly, but we've also had the concepts of the 2 phases, Phase 2, which is the combat reconnaissance vehicle, Phase 3, the infantry fighting vehicle, which were linked under Labor for the benefit of the synergies and the involvement of Australian industry, and the possibilities of the 2 platforms being quite related, were abandoned under the Abbott administration, who split those 2 phases for some unknown reason and pushed Phase 3 way out beyond the timelines that were feasible and credible. For those who don't understand that fact, it's the issue that relates to the fact that the M113s, which are Vietnam-era platforms, which many could argue are actually beyond their use-by date now, and in fact you could make the argument are not deployable because they can't survive in the current complex environments of improvised explosive devices and the like. And so we are really now expecting to push those out well beyond a lifetime that is sustainable. Of course, the other issue there is the reduction in numbers. As I mentioned, Labor had set a 1,100 target, which related to the current usage of combat reconnaissance vehicles in the ASLAVs and the M113 numbers. Now, the ASLAVs have been flogged in recent operational deployments from Timor to Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. One of the most utilised platforms in the ADF inventory, and now well and truly feeling their age and use and won't be able to be used beyond probably 2021. But we've seen the numbers in the combat reconnaissance vehicle aspect of that project drop from the 253 ASLAVs we currently have down to 225, and the numbers just keep falling in this space. So that's also of great concern. There's more I could say about Land 400, but hopefully we will determine more out of the Senate estimates process coming up this week. But I'm greatly concerned that really good defence industries in Australia have been excluded from that participation. Why EOS, a great company that does world-leading remote weapon stations, was excluded from competition in this space, I have no idea. It's led to a great deal of anger amongst authorities like Lieutenant General Lay and others who well understand this project. Elphinstone in Tasmania, which do fantastic metal bending, really should have been proactively and aggressively worked into this project. And the two final bids that have been accepted, it's really inexplicable why the GDLS Talus bid and the Elbit Terex bid were excluded from competition as well. So much more will need to be explained about that, and also the lack of numbers in this budget over the forward estimates for Land 400 is mystifying. Just to address specifically the Minister for Defence Industry statements that Labor didn't commission a single local construction of a vessel in the 6 years that we were in government. This is incredibly misleading about what it takes to do major fleet unit projects in this nation or anywhere. It takes many, many years of planning and process. Now, just to take, for example, the Collins project. In replacing the Oberon submarines, the process actually began in 1978, and we finally got around to building the actual facilities for the Collins through that 1987 to 90 period, and construction of the submarines began in 1990. That gives you an idea of the length of process. Now, to bell the cat on that, this is the government's own naval shipbuilding plan. And I refer to what it says there about the 12 future submarines project that it discusses in here in terms of the truth about those timelines, when it says that effectively the length of a submarine construction process means that Australia will need to be planning for the follow-on submarine capability well before the 12th future submarine enters service. Now, that's the truth of submarine construction. So planning for the replacement of the Collins should have begun well before the last boat hit the water, 2001-2003, in that period. When we got government in 2007, absolutely no work had been done on the replacement of the Collins. What also we found that there'd been no investment in sustainment and maintenance of the Collins. So we were hard-pressed to keep one vessel in the water. So we immediately threw $700 million at remediating that sustainment and maintenance issue and got up to very good standards of availability. Also, through that process, we delved into issues to do with deep cycle maintenance and improving that, including hull cutting techniques and the like, which have placed us well for moving into future submarine construction. But trying to claim that nothing was done in that 6 years is a complete myth and a falsehood. Apart from the sustainment and maintenance issue that we addressed, we immediately looked at what needed to be done to replace the Collins. So the first part of that process was to do the service life evaluation program for the Collins submarine to work out how long we had with the Collins, whether we could do a local build or whether we would be forced into a military off-the-shelf purchase. And at the same time did a due diligence study of those military off-the-shelf options. What we discovered in that, looking at programs like the Ohio-class submarine program in the United States, is that yes, we could get quite a few extra cycles, 7-year cycles out of the Collins. So the Ohio-class, for example, they extended that program by 10 years. So we knew we could cope with that by extending the life of the Collins. We immediately then engaged in selecting the combat system, the ANBYG-1 combat system, which the government has proceeded with as well. And the other aspect, the key aspect that you build a boat around, aside from combat system, is propulsion. So we immediately set funds aside to do a land-based propulsion testing facility to progress that aspect of the project. We also allocated $266 million in the 2013 budget to fund 85 separate activities and contracts to get the whole submarine process rolling. Now, what we had was Prime Minister Abbott coming in with his famous captain's pick process, wanted to go with a Japanese submarine off the shelf and was trying to reverse engineer all of these processes around achieving that simply because of some vague relationship or other issues. a submarine that was not suitable for Australian operational demand and requirements and environments. So that actually just blew out of the water, to coin a phrase, the whole process and delayed it by 4 years effectively. The competitive evaluation process, we will say, has managed to finally get things on track, and we won't take issue with the selection there in terms of the technical capabilities of the Barracuda, the DCNS proposal, and we're hoping that that project works out all right. But there are many question marks around now the huge problem that's been created for us in the loss of skills and industrial capacity. Industrial capacity that we spent $1 billion remediating. Just to backtrack a bit there, I might, for the benefit of history, also correct some of Minister Pyne's assertions in that it was Labor that created the modern shipbuilding capacity in Australia by bringing home the last 2 of the Adelaide-class Perry frigates to be built in this country, which then rolled into the constructions of the Anzac frigates, which was a great success story and built tremendous capacity in this country. Then, of course, rolling into the Collins submarine, which set this country up very well in that space as well. Very complicated systems we're talking about here in terms of naval architecture, systems management, systems integration and engineering skills. All of that was lost because nothing was done, as I mentioned, through that period from the construction of the last Anzacs and the last submarines. So we lost a great deal of capacity. Labor remediated that capacity, got the workforce back up to over 4,000 skilled workers. We made tremendous gains in productivity and quality, and the fact that we were maintaining yards in Newcastle and Melbourne helped us to manage that process. So when we ran into quality or productivity issues or workload issues, we were able to shift blocks around yards. So initially taking blocks away from BAE while they built up and remediated productivity and quality, and then when workload became a problem of Forjax, giving 4 blocks back to BAE in Melbourne. So what we're facing now is this so-called valley of death issue. Now, Labor had fully intended to address that, and of course we produced a shipbuilding plan, which was a far more substantial document than this pamphlet, which, if you go through it, I counted it, there's at least 9 repetitions of paragraphs in here to flesh this thing out. This, if you come from a military background, you read this and you say, that, my friend, is not a plan. There's a lot of motherhood statements and flagging of skills issues which wouldn't have existed if the government had simply, under Prime Minister Abbott, picked up this shipbuilding plan and run with it. Because in here we flag the necessity to move toward a continuous rolling build, which creates the efficiencies for the long term and saves, as flagged in here, tens of billions of dollars for the Australian taxpayer. But those skills have bled out. Now, we were going to address that particularly by moving forward with an immediate build of the supply vessels. Now, the supply vessels could have been built here. In fact, I have the written recommendations from the Defence Department to me, which said that a full in-country build for this project could provide critical workflow to Australia's naval shipbuilding sector all across 3 shipyards, avoiding the costly decline of specialist skills between completion of the LHD and AWD projects and the start of the future submarine. They said that actually moving ahead with this project, not only could we do it, but we should, because that would have addressed, and they say it here in this optimisation plan, that it could overcome the imminent impact of the valley of death on the sustainability of the national shipbuilding industry and retention of critical skills. There are no known reasons why either design that we were contemplating at the time could not be entirely built in Australia. So what happened? Obviously, Prime Minister Abbott, another captain's pick saga, decided he wanted to mend fences with Korea, who he'd annoyed over another aspect, which I can't go into detail on, and also to secure the free trade agreement. Decided to ask them to build a Spanish design in Korea, which was crazy in itself. And of course, when Prime Minister Abbott was moved on, the government quite rightly said, well, we won't do that. Let's ask the Spaniards to build a Spanish vessel, which did make more sense. However, we are still seeing the consequences now of not pushing forward with those massive vessels over 20,000 tonnes, which would have pushed us into a whole new category of capability in shipbuilding, and as I mentioned, bridge that valley of death, saving us tens of billions of dollars, as indicated in these plans. When you go back to cold starts in shipbuilding, you are causing yourself a world of grief, and it poses serious questions over the timelines and the skills approach that the government will take. And there's a much greater need for an aggressive approach to that skills issue, with the attacks that have been made on TAFEs and the skills needs out there and the timelines that are spelled out there. you know, when we're talking about engaging in the future frigate project, for example, in 2020, serious question marks over whether that will be met. So this is a budget that continues a tradition, and a bad one.